cybercrime affecting charities. Like all organizations, charities are vulnerable to scam artists who attempt to carry out fraud and cybercrime. And now, more than ever, charities need to be aware of fraud and take steps to protect their organizations, their donors, and their assets. Frankly, it's not a matter of if it will happen, but when it will happen. I took the liberty of inserting some links that were shared with me during a conference call a day ago from the National Association of Secretaries of State. Those links are in the chat box. Please do not construe these resources as an endorsement of any product, service, or provider, rather simply as a resource for your consideration. The notes that are in there, the links that are in there, as well as the content and today's presentation is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be legal advice. So without further ado, I am really thrilled to introduce you to our panelists. First up is Heather Iliff. Heather is the president and CEO of the Maryland Association of Nonprofits. She is responsible for advancing the organization's vision for creating a highly effective, ethical, and accountable nonprofit sector that drives change through collective action and advocacy. Previously, she served as the vice president of Maryland Nonprofits and director of the Maryland Nonprofits Consulting Group. Heather is an experienced facilitator, trainer, and manager with international, national, and local nonprofits. She served a 4-year term as an elected member of the Prince George's County Maryland Board of Education and was appointed to the County Executive Rusharon Baker's Commission on Educational Excellence for Prince George's County. Earlier in her career, she was the Deputy Director of Alliance for Nonprofit Management and Assistant Director for the Institute of Educational Policy at Open Society Institute in Budapest. Ms. Iliff has been a featured speaker at national conferences, including Organizational Development Network Annual Conference, the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Performance Conference, Alliance for Nonprofit Management Annual Conference, and the Association of Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. Heather holds a bachelor's degree in international studies from the American University and a master's in political science from the Central European University, University of the State of New York. She is a licensed consultant with the Standards for Excellence Institute. Heather?
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I didn't realize you were going to include all that. It's very humbling and really appreciate being here with all of you. As you mentioned, I'm Heather Iliff with Maryland Nonprofits, and we just finished up our annual conference, and it's been quite a week of nonprofits connecting with each other on a variety of issues and helping organizations make sure that they have systems and processes and organizational infrastructure in place is always a challenge in a environment where resources are scarce and resources for general operating support are sometimes hard to come by. And that's the kind of resources we need to protect ourselves from fraud, to make sure that we have financial management practices in place and internal controls and checks and balances and all of those things. And so I think larger nonprofits, medium-sized nonprofits, and small nonprofits each have their own kinds of challenges in how to prevent fraud. So when you're a small nonprofit, you may not have all the resources and staff expertise for your systems and processes. When you're a large nonprofit, you have so many more moving parts in terms of many staff who may or may not be aware of the kinds of scammers that are out there and trying to victimize the organization. And I'll just say, from, as you said, Kathleen, that since the beginning of COVID, things have gotten so much worse, so much more difficult in protecting our organizations from especially online types of fraud. And we're hearing that from our members. We have experienced it ourselves, whether it's phishing scams, unemployment insurance scams, many of the hacking, all of these things are leaving nonprofits vulnerable and often without a lot of tools to address these issues. And of course, the best medicine is prevention. And so I'm so pleased that we're having this panel today.
Thank you so much, Heather. Also with us today is Chuck Adkins. Chuck is the CFO of Fund for Educational Excellence. Chuck oversees all aspects of the organization's finances, human resources, and strategic fiscal planning, including financial reporting to the fund's board, the public, and key stakeholders. Chuck brings over 15 years of experience in nonprofit financial and organizational management. Before joining the Fund for Educational Excellence, Chuck served as the Chief Financial Officer for several nonprofits focused on education, social services, environmental standards, and established best nonprofit best practices. He holds a master's degree from the University of Maryland, where he has taught the graduate courses on nonprofit management. Chuck has a passion for human rights and enjoys random thoughts, cooking and eating, and travel. Chuck?
Hi, Kathy, and thanks again so much for hosting this and inviting me to be on the panel. When you reached out to me, like, this was one of those panels that I was like, I don't have to think very hard to think of the examples. These things are happening quite frequently. And I'm really, really honored to be here. So I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Fund for Educational Excellence. We are Baltimore City's only local education fund. So what that means is that we work with students, parents, local nonprofits, advocates, to really ensure that we are expanding resources so that all children in Baltimore City public schools experience an effective and equitable education. We also serve as a fiscal sponsor for some other local community groups. And what that means is that, simply put, we provide finance, grants management, and HR services to groups that do not have their own 501c3 nonprofit status. So their finances are tucked up inside of us. You know, in terms of the introduction, I think that's enough, you know, for me. I have my stories and I'm ready to go once you tell me that it's time to start talking about stories.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Also with us today is Audra Hurd. Audra is the Operations Director for Adoptions Together. Audra is responsible for the agency's information technology, security, compliance, marketing, human resources, licensing, and facilities management. She earned a bachelor's degree from Towson University in health science and a master's in business administration from the University of Maryland Global Campus. Audra has over 15 years of experience analyzing problems, collaborating with teams, and leveraging technology to resolve operational challenges. When she's not working, Audra loves reading, hiking, camping, and spending time with her family. Audra?
Thank you. Like Chuck, this was a panel opportunity that seemed very appropriate and something that I was really interested in and excited to be part of. As many people in the nonprofit industry, I kind of started out as an accidental techie and, you know, grew through years of training and IT by Google, you know, trying to learn how to manage things. And as our organization has grown, we've learned a lot of lessons over the years in cybersecurity, in risk management, in compliance, and why these things are so crucial. Like the other panelists, I have a number of stories and some lessons that I've learned over the years in change management, getting buy-in from all the users and leadership and everyone involved in actually really implementing cybersecurity processes so they work, and trying to actually get funding and support for these types of processes. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Audra. And our final panelist is Rob Cannon. Rob is the Executive Vice President of George's Company, an independent insurance agent dealing with personal, business, and employee benefits. He provides current nonprofit endorsements include the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations, the Delaware Alliance for Nonprofit Advancement, and Village to Village. His areas of focus include specialty liability coverage as directors and officers, professional, abuse and molestation, fiduciary, and cyber, and health, including small business health, tax credit, HSA, HRA, and FSA. He helps individuals enroll in Medicare supplements and provide support with enrollment in all parts of Medicare. I'm very grateful for each of you to be here. But Rob, do you have a thought you'd like to share before we begin our panel?
Sure. I was thrilled to hear about this opportunity and to be a part of it. As Heather, you know, certainly it was probably about 2 years ago when I took the initiative to try to introduce the importance of cybersecurity and cyber liability to my clients, including the nonprofit sector. So it's been an uphill climb, and it's nice to see that there's really some momentum that's being gained, and there's some people that are really starting to open their mind to the fact that this is a serious issue. Insurance is one component of a way to deal with it, but we're seeing a lot more activity. Unfortunately, the bad actors are getting better, they're getting meaner, they're getting greedier, and the frequency is unbelievable. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's going on these days, but I was glad to be a part of it when what I consider to be kind of early in the process, and have learned a lot since then. So this is wonderful for me too. Thank you, Kathy.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for being here. And thank you to each of our panelists. I should share that while there are no PowerPoint presentations for today, today's town hall will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be available online on the Office of the Secretary of State's Charity tab. That's the presentation portion. We hope to have a Q&A, questions and answers, at the end with time permitting, but that section will not be recorded. And again, just a reminder for those who may have just joined us that the content and presentation today is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be legal advice or an endorsement of any kind. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Heather for you to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I wanted to just thank all the panelists, and I'm so glad that you had the session on Monday with the actual experts in cybersecurity. And so we're really showing up as a nonprofit ourselves who have been experiencing cybersecurity issues, as well as hearing from our members about the challenges that they're facing. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has created a perfect storm for this kind of crime. And I'll just share an example, and we have many, and I think you'll hear many examples. We had a new staff member onboarded during COVID. This is someone, you know, who you've never met face to face, and is straight out of college and starting in her first job. And so normally, or typically, you know, we're just letting our employees know, keep an eye out for phishing scams and things like that. Hadn't even occurred to me that we hadn't built that into our new employee orientation and onboarding. Not to mention that during COVID, you know, we have a 12-step new employee onboarding process that, you know, in COVID, we're going to skip some of those steps, or even where do we even find that checklist, you know, just jump right in and start doing the work, because we were just flat out 24/7 with the crisis. And so, you know, she's starting her new job, and suddenly, and she's, you know, entry level. We're not a huge organization. We have about 20 staff, but she starts receiving emails from the CEO, can you please go buy me a gift card? She takes that very seriously, and she had never been the victim of a scam like that. And she spent almost the entire day following the instructions of these scammers to, you know, get around the many barriers that companies have set up to prevent that kind of gift card fraud. And by the time she figured out that it was a scam, she had spent $800 of her own money. We did decide to reimburse that to her. And so that was another thing that I'd just like to share in terms of our employees are being victimized. And we have other examples that I can share later. And we see that as that was a on-the-job risk that we exposed her to and had not properly trained her to prevent her from utilizing her own funds. And I just say that, and then in our, financials, it shows, fraud reimbursement. And I shared that story with several other people who were all really surprised that we had reimbursed her. And they thought, their minds were in, disciplining her for having fallen victim to that. And so I just want to really put that out there that if we're exposing our employees to risk just by nature of being employees with us, we do have a responsibility to make them whole from my perspective. But I'm happy to share other examples, but I would say that I have, it was ongoing prior to the pandemic, these different kinds of, crazy emails that you would get or viruses that you would be sent and things like that. But I think it's spiked probably 300% since March of last year. And so the vigilance that we have to keep is significantly heightened.
Thanks, Heather. You gave a great example there, and I think one that many organizations have either faced or will likely confront sometime in the not terribly distant future. Would you share just a few of your most salient lessons learned through this cybersecurity, encounter that you've had and becoming victimized? I'll just leave it there and let you take it off.
Yes, well, one that I'll share is my own personal resistance to some of the security measures that were recommended. And when we were having our pre-panel call, everybody's like, "Oh, I bet that was dual factor authentication." And I was like, "You got it." So I was worried about, employees being asked to use their own cell phones for dual factor. I was worried about the convenience factor. I have to say, I think we all struggle with passwords, and our list of passwords is in the hundreds in our organization. And so but I didn't have anyone sort of knocking on my door saying, "You got to do dual factor authentication. You got to do dual factor authentication." And if people aren't familiar with what that is, I'll just share what that means. Is when you go to log into a system, your username and password are part of your login process, but then it also has to send a code to another device. Probably everyone's familiar with that because your bank uses it and other things. So I was resistant to using that for our Microsoft 365, platform that we use every day. I was worried that would be inconvenient for people. And we ended up getting hacked and going for more than a week without regular access to our email, and exposing many of the people who were in our email lists to the same phishing virus that we were exposed to. So it was sending things out from us to the wider community to click on this and experience the same hack. And that's what it took to get through my thick head that we needed to put dual factor authentication in place. So if anyone doesn't have it, please don't be like us and get that done.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to turn to our panelists now and ask them if they have any comments or questions for Heather. So Audra, Rob, and Chuck.
So yeah, if I can just continue on the COVID-19 thing. So what happened with COVID, as everybody experienced, more people were working remotely. And does anybody remember the scramble to try to get the ability to actually work remotely when traditionally we had worked in the office. I mean, what most people did is they tried to get up to speed as quickly as possible. So speed became sort of the goal and not security. So we had people that were working with personal devices, with their home Wi-Fi. You know, the firewalls might not have been as good. The antivirus on the routers might not have been as good. They may have been taking shortcuts because in the sense of just trying to keep business moving forward. So we had a lot of reasons. Some people were using personal emails instead of their business emails. And so, you know, we've seen this multiple times. For example, most of you recall when the city had a major problem. Chuck, you probably recall, you know, at a former organization, something that happened outside the organization impacted other organizations, and they were completely shut out of their ability to actually do work. We had, you know, groups with 50, 100 employees using Gmail accounts to do all of their work. So in the spirit of trying to keep providing service and keep things moving forward, there was a tremendous opportunity for a breakdown in security. And some people were impacted by that, and some were lucky that they weren't. But that's just one example of the difficulty with remote work that happened initially. And fortunately, it's probably better that it was a year and a half ago, because these days the people that are trying to get in and trying to take over from us are much better than they used to be.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you, Heather, for that great insights that you've shared. I appreciate it. Chuck, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. So I think I'm going to share kind of the scariest one that I've experienced. I mean, I would say that all of us on the panel probably have a list of multiple ones we could share. And this was an email hack that tried to change an ACH routing number to transfer $600,000 through the payable system. So, you know, our payable system is how we pay our bills. And what ended up happening was a colleague of mine who frequently sends bills for approval into the system in order to get them paid, her email was hacked, and someone went in and saw that she had sent a $600,000+ invoice into the system. And what they did was they took that email, that invoice, they doctored the PDF, changed the routing number, the account number, and then they pretended to be her and sent it back into the payable system, saying that they had updated their bank account information and they needed their ACH information changed. And you know, so, you know, I say this in all transparency, it was partially a little bit of luck that I was CC'd on that email and my spider sense went off. We pay 100 bills a week here. We're a pretty large organization. So, you know, there's it's not unusual for us to pay a $600,000 invoice. And, but my spider senses went off. There was just something about how that email was worded that didn't make a lot of sense to me. The reason they changed the bank information just didn't make sense to me. So when I saw that, you know, I sort of stopped everything. I found out that they had gone in actually and deleted it from her email account after they sent it. So when I called her and I was like, Sharon, I'm calling you about this email. She's like, I don't remember this email. And I'm like, well, can you search for these keywords in your email? And she's like, I cannot find this email. And, you know, it took us a while to figure out exactly what happened and how this occurred. But it was one of those moments where, you know, my heart was racing that under my watch, you know, an invoice of that size could have possibly gotten through and the funds transferred to not the correct vendor. Based on that experience, we did a number of changes into our processes and policies. Just like Heather said, two-factor authentication came on for every person who could send email into the payable system. We also implemented forced password changes for email so that people's passwords are being changed more frequently. Most likely how this happened was that my colleague was using a password that she used in her personal life, and I'm sure that password got out, through some other security breach. We also changed that any ACH changes have to be initiated by us using our vendor management system, which uses Adobe Sign and requires a number of steps that we have for internal controls. I also purchased additional insurance based on that piece and that happening. And then I changed that all payments over $100,000 would be issued by check as another resource, just to put another step in there to say, this is a risk level that one aligns with their insurance coverage, but two, it is a more tolerable number for us to think about with fraud than, a $600,000 invoice going out. So that was probably my scariest one. And then the one that happened last week was a donor check fraud. The donor mailed a check somewhere. It did not arrive here. It either was mailed to the wrong place, dropped off to the wrong place. And all of a sudden the donor calls us and says, someone in your office changed my check to $6,300 when I wrote it for $25. And, so we had to, reassure that donor. That's a relationship that's been built up. And we take a very active role in trying to help that donor understand what happened, because that check ultimately never arrived here and did not go through our processing. So, these things are happening frequently. And I think that part of it is, we all wear these many hats in the nonprofit sector, and we are constantly triaging so many things, and this is just one more thing that we have to think about. But it's really important to take it seriously because it's very real, and it happens. It happens a lot.
Amazing. So, you really talked about some of the questions that I would have had about what you've done to mitigate loss and risk. And it sounds like you've really taken some very proactive approaches. But let me ask you, how easy was it to implement those changes, and how open was your staff? I see you laughing.
That's a great question. First we had to explain two-factor authentication and how it wasn't as bad as it sounded like. The immediate thought was every time I log on, and it's like, well, no, every time you change devices. So we had to do some education about the levels that we were implementing. We also had discussions about sort of how do we all manage our passwords? Forcing password changes, people roll their eyes at you, and you're like, well, these things are real. And when people actually heard the risk that we were navigating, I think that was a really helpful way of saying we're all in this together. This is not just IT's job. This is not just finance's job. This is a collective job for all of us to be sort of protecting our mission. And we drove it back to our mission is, these are the tools and resources we use and need in order to push their mission forward. The insurance was, not bad. We're a larger size organization. We're about a $25 million per year org. And so adding another layer of insurance wasn't complicated for us. And then, I had a little bit of pushback when I said we would not ACH payments over 100K. There can be exceptions, but as the CFO, they would come through me if anyone wanted to move around that policy. And if it's needed, I could do a lot more verification. I could do a verbal verification. I could, I would call the number listed on the website of the vendor and then find my way to finance to get to the person to verify the information, versus, saying, well, where's that email with the phone number they sent me? So, if we really needed to wire or ACH a vendor over that amount, we're able to do it, but it has a lot more sort of internal steps in there.
Great. Thanks so much, Chuck. So now I'll ask Heather and Audra and Rob if they have any thoughts or comments about what Chuck just presented.
So I'll add another vulnerability that we luckily did not have any breach, but we just realized was a vulnerability for us, is we had all of our shared passwords in an Excel file on our shared drive. And so this is, we have a subscription to the Baltimore Sun and the Chronicle of Philanthropy and Canva and all of these places, grant portals and everything that multiple staff need to access with using the same login and password. And so, we had been, if staff departed, we would change their access, we would obviously, they wouldn't have access to the shared drive anymore. But this Excel sheet, we just thought, they could have emailed that to themselves at any point. We knew it wasn't secure. So, and again, to your point, we're not endorsing any product here, but we searched and we found a product called RoboForm. And it is a password, it's a enterprise-wide password management system, and it works fantastically. So each day I log in once to RoboForm, and if I go to any of the sites that are saved in our RoboForm system, RoboForm logs in for me using that encrypted information. And you have a hierarchy inside that program where you can have passwords that only the CEO has access to. You can have passwords that certain staff have access to, or passwords that everyone has access to. So that has helped us with the password. And RoboForm can also generate, very complicated random passwords for you as well, so that you're not using passwords that you're using in your personal life.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. In anticipation of questions that we may get during the Q&A, if you don't mind, just to put that information into, and this is for all of our panelists, into the chat box for those who are participating, that'd be awesome, please. Thank you. So thanks again, Chuck, for your presentation. Audrey, you're now up.
All right. So we started our journey into cloud environments a little earlier than some nonprofits. Between the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2016, we made a choice really because we had 4 locations, and our staff at our satellite offices were really feeling kind of like the stepchildren, like that they didn't have the same kind of access and environment as people in the headquarters office or things like that. So we made the choice to move our entire infrastructure to the cloud during 2015. And as part of that, integrated with Microsoft 365. And during that experience, we had also transitioned into providing therapy services. We started out in adoption, but moved into providing therapy services because of that work that we're doing. We were then had to be HIPAA compliant. And because we were doing payments online, we had to be PCI compliant. So our journey kind of started really because we were in the cloud. We knew we had to be more secure because of the way we were working, and because we had all these compliance factors. And we really started out slowly at first with just the things that we could figure out how to do that were lower or no cost. One of those was in Office 365, turning on encryption and multi-factor authentication, as Heather and some of the other panelists have talked about. Also turning on things like data loss protection and mobile device management. So those were things that were already included in the platform that we were paying for, that we just kind of had to do some research and figure out how it worked and how we could turn it on, but it made our environment a little more secure. We were also already using Windows Enterprise on our staff laptops. So we learned we could turn BitLocker on and encrypt all the hard drives on all those laptops in case they were lost or stolen. So we kind of started that way. And then really grew, as the years went on. And I'll kind of echo some of the things that the other panelists have mentioned. One of the things that's been really important is training our staff, not just on the details of cybersecurity, but really understanding that the majority of breaches come from the user who clicks a link in an email or opens an attachment. And so that they were a critical part of the process. And so we started training all of our staff and interns and anyone that worked with us, when they first started. And then we subscribed to a service called KnowBefore, which does security training and phish testing for all of our employees. So it kind of helps them. And we do PCI and HIPAA training through KnowBefore as well. So we kind of hit our compliance pieces and, our security pieces. But our staff have found it really helpful, and not just in their work environment, but just as a digital consumer in their day-to-day life. They've learned a lot of things that they wouldn't have known, that have helped them just be better consumers in general. So we've had a lot of, thankfulness for that program. And one of the other things we did, kind of echoing Heather, is we added an enterprise level password system. We use LastPass, and it allows us to have shared folders that we can put people into groups and share certain things, but also have our own things. And we also decided that we would provide cell phones for users who weren't comfortable using their own, because we felt like if we're putting all of this technology in place and we're requiring people to use it, we need to make sure that they're comfortable with the things that we're doing. Otherwise, they're just going to go around them and create workarounds. So we worked with them to figure out what their processes were and how they worked. And then we put solutions in that kind of worked with them, so it wasn't so hard for them. And so that's been, they're not the greatest cell phones in the world. They're like old iPhone 7s, but for people who don't want to use their own devices for work things, it gives them the ability to have all their work tools without having to, compromise on their personal security. So those are some of the things that have been really helpful. And having risk assessments done, we got some grant funding to do a risk assessment. And that was a really good thing that we were able to take to the board and leadership and say, this outside source has said, these are the things we need to focus on. These are what we need to do next. These are what we need to find funding for. These are what we need to put in our budget. And that was a really helpful way to kind of get some buy-in on what needed to be done.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Cultural change is the most critical and the most difficult to manage. So you talked a little bit about how you got staff's buy-in, but you didn't talk so much about how you got the board's buy-in. Do you mind to share a little bit about that?
Sure. I will say we have an amazing board. Our board is just fantastic, and they're all really involved. And so it's been a pleasure working with them over the years. But they have been very, their goal is to make sure that the organization is running efficiently, soundly, using best practices, best financial management. And we were able to show that, we had some risks where if we didn't work on targeting those, it could really damage the organization. And, we've had a few experiences. We had a ransomware attack that luckily we were able to stop and take care of. We used to allow contractors to use personal email accounts, and we had one who was a therapist who got hacked and her client data was exposed. So we've had a few things where we've just learned lessons, but taking those things to the board and then taking the external assessment and saying, these are the risks, and this could really be an issue, and this could stop us from operating, if this happened. That really helped them to see the seriousness. We also had some security assessments done that said, that showed even just in the month we're seeing about 800 failed attempts to log into our Office 365 environment every month from all around the world. The only country that hasn't, the only continent is Antarctica that we haven't had, that that attempt of access. But we have 35 staff. We're not a huge organization, and we've got really important client data and donor data. And if that gets breached, it could really shut us down with all the pieces that are involved in remediating. So that was kind of how that transition has happened. We really started out fairly low cost, and every year we kind of go back, reassess, look at the risk, figure out where we're at. The things I've proposed for the 2022 budget are the highest we've ever been at, and I'm not quite sure if they'll get approved, but I'm hoping. But like Heather said, the number of attacks have been so high since the pandemic. It's just critical.
Well, 800 failed attempts is really a stunning number for an organization your size. Just stunning. There's no question about that. I'm going to invite now Heather, Rob, and Chuck. Do you have any comments or thoughts for Audra before we move on to our final panelist?
Yes. You spoke about the cloud and payment services. I just wanted to put a caution out there. While those are very good and they're becoming more and more popular, they do not remove any liability on your part if something happens, out there. So just everyone be conscious of the fact that while that may be an excellent decision, an excellent strategy, it doesn't necessarily absolve you of potential liability if there's a problem. You talked about a risk assessment also. One of the things that the insurance companies are doing now is they're utilizing some of the same strategies as some of the hackers. So, for example, if you try to apply for a quotation, some of the companies are actually trying to see if you've got windows and doors open to your system, ports, etc. And they do this and they don't charge you. So sometimes they're actually doing a little bit of a risk assessment for you in determining whether or not they want to provide insurance coverage and at what price. The other thing you mentioned was about the board. Boards sometimes are reluctant to change or additional expense. Sometimes they're backward looking. We haven't had any problems in the past. We think we're okay. Everything's fine. And with regard to cybersecurity, sometimes when I have that feedback from a potential client, I say it might not be a bad idea to have the IT folks speaking to the board, because they are the people who probably have more credibility than maybe one of us. So just a thought.
Thanks, Rob. Heather or Chuck?
I do have a sort of a question about, you spoke, Audrey, about like how there's this personal and professional blurring that you were experiencing and your staff have experienced. And you spoke about it from a positive perspective, but I experienced it, and I'm wondering if this relates with a slight negative perspective whenever unemployment fraud hit. Because unemployment fraud was hitting some of our employees, and they were coming to us with the assumption that the data came from us. The data breach came from us, and we had to do a lot of discussion about, well, what data do we have? How is it stored? What are its weaknesses, its strengths, etc.? And also at the same time explain that this type of data is out there for every credit application you've applied for, and things of that nature. And so I'm wondering if you've had any experience on the negative side of that professional personal blend.
We definitely have. And what's interesting with LastPass, we have the opportunity to incorporate, create a free personal account and then incorporate it with our business account so that we can separate our personal and business passwords. And then when someone leaves, they can take their personal and we can redistribute the business passwords if needed. And so there are security scores from the admin dashboard. I can see there were 10 users last month who had below a 50% security score in their passwords. And I sent them out messages like, okay, you need to get these up. I want to see higher numbers. It's important that your passwords are strong enough so that, you don't have an issue. And And one came back, well, all my work passwords are good. It's just the personal ones that are all the same, and I don't care about those, you know? Like, you know?
Yeah.
Then there's that, right? Well, thanks so much, Audrey. I know we could continue that conversation, but Rob is up next. So Rob.
Okay, so where are we today? Ransomware is probably the biggest growing area that people are experiencing. And a lot of folks think that we're a small organization, we're not vulnerable, nobody cares about us, you know, they're going to be going for the big ones. Well, ransomware relies more upon the willingness to pay than it does the revenue. So if a hacker is trying to get $100,000 from one organization, he or she may have much greater success trying to get 10,000 from 10 different organizations because they can afford it and they can make it go away, and then they can try to fix the problem after the fact. So what we're seeing is that the targeting is different than it used to be a year or so ago. So I just want people to be conscious of the fact that the landscape is changing. You know, we hear some of the federal authorities saying, don't pay ransom. You're not supposed to do that. The FBI doesn't want you to pay. There are other organizations that don't want you to pay. And the question that's going to be discussed more and more these days is it legal to pay? Whether you pay or the insurance company pays. So it's a difficult issue because generally if you're shut out of your system, you want to get back into your system. And the probability of being willing to pay is kind of great. So what I think this is trying to communicate is that the security portion of this is very important. Some of the things that we've done, whether we wanted to or not, are things like a virtual protected network. So if I'm at home trying to log in here, really all I need is an internet connection to be able to get in here into the system. And when I get into the system, I have the same security as when I'm here. But it's an encrypted communication so that makes it secure, just as if I'm in Starbucks or I'm in the airport or on a train. So a virtual protected network is, I think, essential for anybody who's working remotely. We have automatic encryption. You know, in our industry, it's not uncommon to have a name, address, date of birth, social security number, driver's license number. So who wants that information being sent over an unsecure, you know, network? So our system is supposed to identify any of those types of numbers and encrypt it whether we remember to or not. So we have manual encryption and we have automatic encryption because of that data. So some of the other things are, we're doing the multi-factor authentication like most of you are. We do the Know Before training, as you do, Audra, and they send out some pretty good information. I don't know if you saw the last one, but there's a new James Bond movie called No Time to Die, and so the hackers are going to be suggesting that you can watch this thing for free, and but you got to provide some information. So if you see anything about that, don't go for it. But it's neat because they provide updates regularly about the latest, and it's some of the stuff that people would think, oh, I'm just going to watch this video or whatever, and it's not dangerous, but it can be. Let's see. Okay, so what we're seeing in terms of the insurance is, as I mentioned, the insurance companies are doing some things to check out what's going on. We're seeing prices increase significantly, deductibles increase significantly, sublimits, they're reducing. I had an organization that is in the law area, and 3 months ago, we got a great quote for them. The quote expired after 2 months. The new quote didn't include social engineering. Social engineering is when, as Chuck referred to, it looks like a legitimate email instructing you to do something, but it came from somebody else. So what we're seeing is changes in coverage offerings, and you need to be very careful because not only are there changes, but they use different terminology. Some companies call it social engineering, some cyber deception. So it's pretty scary, even if you're trying to do the right thing because of some of those types of things. So one of the other things is, okay, what happens when you do actually have a breach? Who do you call? One of the most difficult things is trying to figure out where to start. Does anybody really know what the notification requirements are to your potential, impacted individuals? If you have an insurance policy, the first thing you do is you notify them and you get a breach coach. The breach coach will tell you what to do. IT forensics is going to come in and try to figure out how they got into the system and if it's still vulnerable. Notification, credit monitoring, the PCI, as you mentioned, Audra, now you have to have an assessment and an audit done to see, if your system is and your policies and procedures are appropriate. What if you have to do data restoration? Who do you call for that? Now you've got a problem. Chuck, as you said, you've got a donor and they find out that the information was obtained. And some of you have experienced this before. So what do you do to try to convince your donors that your system is secure and they're safe, giving you their bank account information, their credit card information? You really need to have a PR effort to try to fix the problem. And then let's say you do everything right and something happens and it's not my fault. And it's because of the unemployment stuff. Or I have an example from a client who, does fee for service with Baltimore City. They called the city and said, hey, we haven't gotten our money this month. And they said, well, yes, we sent it to you last week. We got the email telling us to change the bank account information. And they said, we didn't change our bank account information. $360,000 was sent to a different bank. And they said, we never sent that to you. You owe us the money. We have a contract with you. You're obligated to pay. They've been working for a month and a half trying to get money from the city, which they are owed, and they didn't do anything wrong. It was not their fault. To my surprise, they've received over $70,000 from the insurance policy, even though they did nothing wrong. So it's very interesting that there's coverage that I never even expected. But it doesn't always have to be your fault. And human error, as you mentioned, Audra, is the number one reason for a problem. Somebody clicks on something that looks perfectly legitimate. It looks like it came from the CFO or the CEO. And so even if you are doing everything right and you're doing the training and all this sort of thing, all you need is that one time when somebody makes a mistake where they were careless or they were in a hurry or something like that, that can cause a big, big problem.
Thanks so much, Rob. Rob, it's been said that insurance policies are, and you alluded to this, are too expensive and that some customers are paying for provisions or clauses that they don't need. So what should a charity look for if they want to explore buying cyber insurance so that their insurance is appropriate to their level of risk?
Well, it's always difficult to determine what the appropriate level of coverage is for any type of a policy. What we see in the industry is significantly different coverage, with different companies and with the same company. For example, with Chubb has 3 different levels of coverage. I call them 1, 2, and 3. And I told our people, don't ever give me a quote that's not 3. I want the broadest possible coverage because I don't want to be endorsing coverage to any of you or any of your members and selling it to you for $1,000. And now you call with a potential claim and you don't have the coverage because it wasn't something that was contemplated. We never expected this to happen. We never even realized it could happen. And then the question is, well, could we have gotten that coverage? And then I say, yeah, it would have cost $1,400. Well, everyone's going to say, I would have paid $1,400 had you told me about that. So I don't even offer that as an opportunity. I would rather somebody have $250,000 of coverage than $1 million, but have broader coverage because, $250,000 is still a lot of money. But yeah, there's resistance regularly about the need for this, and the difficulty is we just don't know what we're going to see tomorrow. And as you mentioned in the very beginning, Kathy, it's not a matter of if something's going to happen. It's a matter of when it's going to happen. And I think every one of us have been potential victims. I mean, I can tell you at least 6 times I've been a potentially impacted by a breach somewhere else, and never was it my fault.
Right.
I mean, the most recent one was the unemployment thing on July 4th. So if you think that these people take vacations, you're wrong. They're working 365 days a year. I had to identify, I had to put a freeze on the 3 credit reporting agencies, notify the Federal Trade Commission and the local police, and the people here got a kick out of it when the officer came into the office to speak to me.
I did the very same thing, Rob, myself, so I hear you. Before I ask Heather and Audra and Chuck for their questions, let me just share that Stephanie Marsiglia in our office is going to be announcing any questions or comments that were put in the chat box. And then Audra or Rob, you both mentioned NobleCorps. If you don't mind, just put the link for that in there, and anyone else who had something that they may have shared, a resource. So Heather, Audra, and Chuck, do you have any comments or thoughts for Rob?
I'll just add, I'll say I'm endorsing Gorgas and Company. They do work with us, and having someone who both knows nonprofit organizations and knows insurance, so you don't buy the wrong thing is so important. And so we appreciate that as a brokerage for all kinds of insurance. And he was the one who called us and said, hey, do you want to have the cybersecurity? We were like, absolutely. The second year of our cybersecurity coverage, then they came back and started asking us questions about, did we have dual factor authentication in place? We had to actually certify in order to keep our insurance that we had some of those practices in place. So that's an additional layer of help that you have just even having that checklist.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, and I'd say too, like, be careful as a nonprofit, depending if you're doing community partnerships or grants or contracts with, other agencies, or especially government agencies. In their contracts now, a lot of them require certain levels of cybersecurity insurance and certain levels of cybersecurity, things. So it's really important to look at the fine print in those contracts as well.
I can mirror that. We had a contract that had some data sharing involved, and based upon the data sharing, we had a list of requirements that we had to have in order to satisfy the contract.
Really good tip. Thanks so much, all of you. Stephanie, would you be good enough, please, to read anything that's in the chat box? And again, as I shared at the beginning of the session, earlier before our session began, I put in the links that I received just the other day from the National Associations of Secretary of States. Again, they're not an endorsement for any product, service, or program, but rather just opportunities if you are so inclined to take advantage of them. Steph?